The cold, sterile light of dawn filtered through the panoramic window of the hotel suite, casting long, sharp shadows across stacks of legal binders and color-coded documents. Pam Bondi stood before the glass, her reflection a stoic silhouette, against the sprawling, awakening metropolis of Washington, D.C. She held a lukewarm mug of black coffee, but she hadn't taken a sip. Her gaze was fixed on the distant, domed monolith of the Capitol, yet her mind was leagues away, navigating the intricate labyrinth of constitutional law, corporate precedent, and the simple, profound weight of human trust. Today was the day, the final day of arguments in what the media had hyperbolically, but not inaccurately dubbed, the trial of the digital century, the people of a united coalition of states v. Omnicorp. Her junior counsel, Ben Carter, a young man whose youthful idealism was perpetually at war with the cynical realities of their profession, sat at the large mahogany table. His tie was already perfectly knotted, a stark contrast to his slightly frayed nerves, which manifested in the rhythmic, almost silent tapping of his pen against a yellow legal pad. He was poring over a highlighted transcript, his brow furrowed. In concentration, he's going to lean on Hallowell Tech Systems, Ben said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the city below. It's his cornerstone, the 1998 ruling on user agreements. He'll argue that every single user clicked "I agree," and that consent, in the eyes of the law, is absolute. He'll paint us as paternalistic regulators trying to protect people from their own choices. Pam turned slowly from the window, her expression unreadable. He will. She agreed, her voice calm and even, and he'll be brilliant doing it. Jonathan Roberts didn't become the most sought-after corporate counsel in the country by being predictable. He's a master weaver. He'll take a single thread of precedent and weave a tapestry so intricate, so seemingly robust, that the judges will be hesitant to pull a single thread for fear of unraveling the entire fabric of established law. She walked over to the table and placed her mug down with a soft click. She ran a finger over the spine of a binder labeled Omnicorp, Internal Communications. But a tapestry, Ben, no matter how beautiful, is still just a collection of threads, and if one of those threads is rotten, the whole thing is compromised. Our job today isn't to tear down his tapestry. It's to hold up one of his own threads and let the court see it for what it is. The case had been a behemoth, a 2-year-long crusade that began with a series of quiet consumer complaints and spiraled into a multi-state investigation she had spearheaded. Omnicorp, the world's most dominant tech conglomerate, stood accused of a systemic and clandestine breach of user data. It wasn't a hack or an external intrusion. It was a feature, not a bug. They had designed their ubiquitous social media platform, Reconnect, and their suite of smart home devices to harvest personal data on a scale previously unimaginable: private conversations, location history, even biometric information, and then utilize that data for undisclosed commercial and political purposes. Jonathan Roberts, Omnicorp's lead counsel, had been a phantom menace throughout the lower court proceedings. He had successfully argued to seal key documents, limit discovery, and had systematically dismantled witness after witness with a surgical precision that was both terrifying and, on a purely professional level, awe-inspiring. He never raised his voice. He never appeared flustered. He wielded logic like a scalpel, making clean, imperceptible incisions until his opponent's case simply bled out on the courtroom floor. He had built a fortress around Omnicorp, constructed from the bricks of fine-print user agreements and the mortar of decades-old legal precedents that were woefully unequipped to address the realities of the 21st century. The media narrative was already set. Pam Bondi, the determined but perhaps outmatched public servant, against the untouchable Jonathan Roberts and his infinitely deep corporate pockets. Pundits on cable news praised Roberts' masterful legal strategy, while sympathetically framing Bondi's efforts as a valiant, but likely futile stand for consumer rights. They saw it as David versus Goliath, but they had forgotten that in the original story, David had a plan. Everything ready? She asked Ben, her voice pulling him from his anxious reverie. He nodded, pushing a slim folder across the table. Final draft of the closing outline. We've timed it. 25 minutes, exactly. It covers the core harm principle, the inadequacy of the consent doctrine in the face of asymmetrical information, and the long-term societal cost. It's solid, it's logical. Pam picked up the folder but didn't open it. She looked at Ben, a rare, faint smile touching her lips. It is solid. You did good work, Ben. But we're not going to use it. Ben's eyes widened. Ma'am, the hearing starts in 90 minutes. That's the argument we've been building for 6 months. And it's the argument Roberts expects, she replied, her gaze sharpening. It's the argument that judges expect. It's a good, sound, logical argument that Jonathan Roberts will respectfully acknowledge, and then gently, methodically, and brilliantly tear to shreds with a precedent from a case about V. Sears in 1985. No, today, we don't fight him on his battlefield. We create a new one. She tapped the binder of internal communications again. The truth is in there, not just in the data and the algorithms, but in their own words. We're going to let Omnicorp hang by its own rope. The drive to the E. Barrett Prettyman United States Courthouse was a blur of flashing cameras and muffled shouts from reporters. Pam stared straight ahead, her face a calm mask. Tuning out the noise, she could feel the pulse of the city's attention. Focused on this single event, it was more than a legal case now. It had become a referendum on the future, on whether the laws written in a world of paper and ink could govern a world of code. And data. As they stepped out of the black sedan, the wall of sound hit them. Microphones were thrust forward. Ms. Bondi, do you have a response to Roberts' pre-trial brief? Is it true the states are prepared to settle? What's your message to the millions of Omnicorp users? She paused for a single, calculated moment at the top of the courthouse steps. She didn't look at any single reporter but addressed the collective entity. Our message is simple, she said, her voice clear and carrying over the din. The principles of privacy and integrity are not subject to a terms of service agreement. We look forward to making our case before the court. Inside, the grand hall was buzzing, a cathedral of law filled with the low murmur of anticipation. Lawyers in crisp suits huddled in quiet conversation. Journalists typed furiously into laptops. In the center of it all, holding court without seeming to, was Jonathan Roberts. He stood with his team, a picture of serene confidence. He was tall, silver-haired, with an academic's posture and a statesman's smile. He caught Pam's eye across the marble floor and gave a slight, respectful nod. It wasn't condescending. It was the nod of a grandmaster acknowledging his opponent before a chess match. A gesture that said, I respect your presence here, even if the outcome is preordained. Pam returned the nod, a silent acknowledgement of the duel to come, as she and Ben made their way to their designated table in the cavernous courtroom. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her. She arranged her files, not the thick binders of their original strategy, but a single, deceptively thin folder. Ben sat beside her, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He trusted her implicitly, but the last-minute change in strategy had left him unmoored. He was operating on pure faith. The 3 judges of the special appellate panel entered and took their seats on the elevated bench. At the center was Chief Judge Ellen Vance, a woman in her late 60s with a reputation for a razor-sharp intellect and an intolerance for legal theatrics. To her right sat Judge Marcus Thorne, a staunch traditionalist and textualist, the one most likely to be swayed by Roberts' arguments on precedent. To her left was Judge Anya Sharma, the youngest on the panel, a specialist in technology law who understood the intricacies of code better than anyone else in the room. It was a balanced but tough panel. The court is now in session, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing in the sudden, profound silence. The Honorable Chief Judge Vance presiding. Judge Vance adjusted her glasses and looked down at the 2 tables. Counsel, we are here today to hear the final oral arguments in Case 23-745, United Coalition of States v. Omnicorp. Each side will have 30 minutes for their presentation and rebuttal. Mr. Roberts, you may begin. Jonathan Roberts rose smoothly to his feet. He walked to the lectern without a single note. His hands resting lightly on its edges, he began. His voice a perfectly modulated baritone that commanded attention without demanding it. May it please the court, he started, his eyes sweeping across the three judges, Chief Judge Vance, Judge Thorne, Judge Sharma. For 2 years, this case has been presented as a complex, almost mystical puzzle of modern technology. My esteemed colleague, the Attorney General, has painted a picture of a sinister corporation, using inscrutable algorithms to manipulate an unsuspecting public. The narrative is compelling, it is emotional, and it is, with all due respect, a fundamental mischaracterization of the issue at hand. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air. This case is not about technology. It is about a principle as old as our republic, the freedom of contract, and a concept as simple as a choice. Every single one of Omnicorp's 2 billion users was presented with a choice. They were presented with terms of service, a user agreement, that clearly outlined the collection and use of data for service improvement and personalization. Every user, of their own free will, scrolled to the bottom of that agreement and clicked a box that said, "I have read and agree to the terms." Judge Thorne leaned forward slightly. His interest peaked. Roberts had gone straight to his comfort zone. The petitioners, Roberts continued, gesturing gracefully toward Bondi's table, would have you believe that this choice was meaningless, that the average citizen cannot be trusted to enter into an agreement, that the government must step in and act as a national nanny, protecting adults from their own decisions. This is not only a paternalistic view, it is a dangerous one. It undermines individual autonomy and chills the very innovation that has propelled our society forward. He then dove into the precedent, citing Hallowell v. Tech Systems and a dozen other cases that upheld the sanctity of contractual agreements. He spoke for 20 minutes, a seamless, uninterrupted flow of logic. He didn't use slides or exhibits. His only tool was the force of his intellect. He made Omnicorp's actions sound not just legal, but necessary, the unavoidable price of a connected, personalized world that consumers themselves demanded. Omnicorp is not some shadowy entity, he concluded, his voice softening with an air of sincere reason. It is a company of innovators, of engineers, of people who come to work every day to build tools that connect families, launch small businesses, and facilitate the free exchange of ideas. The data they utilize allows them to provide these services, most of them for free, to billions. To cripple this model, based on a philosophical disagreement with the nature of modern consent, would be to throw the baby out with the bathwater. It would punish a company for fulfilling its end of a bargain that 2 billion people willingly made. The petitioners have shown no concrete, individualized harm that wasn't explicitly covered by the agreement they ask you to invalidate. Therefore, we respectfully ask the court to affirm the lower court's ruling and dismiss this case. He gave a slight bow of his head and returned to his seat. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was a masterful performance. He had framed the debate entirely on his terms. He had sounded reasonable, respectful of the law, and had painted Bondi and the states as emotional anti-business regulators. Ben Carter's face was pale. He glanced at the unused folder with their carefully prepared counterarguments. Now, seemingly obsolete, Judge Vance looked over at their table. Ms. Bondi. Pam rose and walked to the lectern. The silence in the room was different now. It was heavier, laced with skepticism. She placed her single, thin folder on the wood, but she didn't open it. She looked at the judges, letting the silence stretch for a moment longer, resetting the rhythm of the room. "May it please the court," she began, her voice quieter than Robert's, yet possessing a different kind of gravity. It was clear, firm, and devoid of artifice. Mr. Roberts is a brilliant lawyer, and he has presented a brilliant and elegant argument. And on its surface, his logic is appealing. He speaks of choice, of contracts, of bargains willingly made. But his entire argument rests on a faulty foundation. A foundation that presumes a bargain can be fair when one party has all the power, all the information, and has intentionally designed the agreement to be incomprehensible. She took a step to the side of the lectern, closing the distance between herself and the bench, a subtle shift that made the exchange feel more like a conversation. He mentioned Hallowell v. Tech Systems, a landmark case, certainly, a case from 1998. In 1998, the internet was a dial-up service. A user agreement was for a piece of software that came in a box. The idea that a company could listen to your private conversations through a device on your coffee table, or track your every movement through your phone, or use your personal data to influence your mood or your vote. That wasn't just unforeseen, it was the stuff of science fiction. Judge Sharma leaned forward, her pen poised to apply a 1998 standard of consent to 21st century technology. Pam continued, "Is like trying to apply traffic laws for a horse and buggy to a supersonic jet. The context has been so fundamentally transformed that the old framework is no longer just inadequate, it is absurd. We are not here to argue that people shouldn't be allowed to make choices. We are here to argue that a choice cannot be considered a choice when it is not informed, and consent cannot be considered consent when it is coerced." Judge Thorne interjected, his voice stern. "Coerced, Ms. Bondi, that's a strong word. No one held a gun to anyone's head. They could have simply chosen not to use the service. This was the question she had been waiting for. With respect, Judge Thorne, in the modern world, is that a realistic choice? Omnicorp's platform is not just a social network. For many, it is their primary connection to family, their main source of news, the storefront for their small business. For a student, it's where their study groups are organized. For a community, it's where local events are announced. To say just don't use it is to say just disconnect from modern society. When a single corporation controls the digital public square, participation feels less like a choice and more like a requirement. That is the definition of coercive power. She had his attention. He was still skeptical, but he was listening. She then turned her attention to Judge Vance. "Mr. Roberts argues that there is no concrete harm. Let me be specific. We have documented evidence of Omnicorp using harvested voice data from its smart speakers private, in-home conversations to target individuals with specific advertising. For sensitive medical conditions, a husband and wife discussing their struggles to conceive a child in the privacy of their bedroom are suddenly inundated with ads. For fertility clinics, a man confiding in a friend about his feelings of depression is targeted with advertisements that prey on his emotional state. This is not service personalization. This is a gross, predatory violation of the most basic human dignity." A wave of unease washed over the gallery. These were not abstract legal theories. They were deeply personal invasions. "Mr. Roberts says his client is a company of innovators, and I don't dispute that," Pam said, her tone becoming sharper, more focused. "But innovation without ethics is a runaway train. And for 2 years, Omnicorp, through its counsel, has told this court and the American people that their actions were, at all times, covered by the fine print of their user agreement. They have built their entire defense on the supposed strength and clarity of that contract." She finally reached down and opened the thin folder. She slid out a single sheet of paper, an exhibit that had been entered into evidence, but largely ignored, buried under terabytes of technical data. "This is Exhibit 7B4. It is not their user agreement. It is not a legal filing. It is a page from Omnicorp's own internal document, their code of corporate ethics, distributed to all employees and signed by their CEO. I would like to read a single sentence from the preamble, a promise they made not to their lawyers, but to themselves." She held the paper up. Her voice was steady, resonant, filling every corner of the silent room. "Omnicorp is built on a foundation of trust. We will never prioritize profit over principle. Our users are not our product, they are our partners. We will treat their data with the highest degree of respect and transparency, as if it were our own." She lowered the paper and looked directly at the judges. "As if it were our own, Your Honors. Would any of us consider it respectful or transparent to have our private conversations recorded and monetized? Would we consider it a partnership to have our deepest vulnerabilities targeted for commercial gain? Of course not." She then turned her body slightly, a subtle but unmistakable pivot to face Jonathan Roberts' table. Mr. Roberts built his argument on the sanctity of an agreement. But what about this agreement? The agreement Omnicorp made with its own conscience. The promise it broadcast to the world to build the very trust it would later exploit. She paused, locking eyes with Jonathan Roberts. He sat perfectly still, his face an unreadable, placid mask. But Pam could see the faintest tightening around his eyes. She had moved the battlefield. This was no longer about Hallowell v. Tech Systems. It was about hypocrisy. The petitioners are not asking this court to dismantle the digital world, she concluded, her voice ringing with clarity. We are asking this court to enforce a simple, timeless principle, that a promise should mean something, that a contract cannot be a shield for predatory behavior, and that a corporation, no matter how powerful or innovative, must be held accountable, not just to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of the trust it solicits from the public. We are asking this court to rule that the foundation of trust, once broken, cannot be repaired with a legal argument. Thank you. She walked back to her table and sat down. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not a silence of anticipation or skepticism. It was a silence of profound contemplation. Ben Carter was staring at her, his expression a mixture of shock and utter admiration. He finally understood. She hadn't tried to out-lawyer the master lawyer. She had outmaneuvered him. She had used his own client's words as a weapon, reframing the entire debate in a way he was unprepared to counter. Chief Judge Vance looked down at her notes, then at Roberts. Mr. Roberts, you have 5 minutes remaining for your rebuttal. This was the moment. The entire courtroom held its breath. Jonathan Roberts, the unflappable titan of corporate law, stood up. He walked to the lectern, his movements as fluid as ever, but there was a stiffness in his posture that hadn't been there before. He arranged his papers, a nervous tic no one had ever seen from him. He was supposed to use this time to surgically dismantle her argument, to dismiss her ethical appeal as legally irrelevant and steer the judges back to the hard rock of precedent. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, Ms. Bondi has spoken with great passion. His voice lacked its earlier resonance. He was stalling, searching for a foothold on this new terrain. She raises important questions about ethics, and Omnicorp, as a leader in the industry, takes its ethical responsibilities very seriously. That document, the Code of Ethics, is a statement of our aspiration, our guiding principles. He was trying to frame it as aspirational, not binding, a mission statement, not a contract. But the damage was done. The stark contrast between the lofty words and the documented actions was hanging in the air. Thick and undeniable. Judge Sharma leaned into her microphone. A question, Mr. Roberts. Is it your position that a company's stated ethical principles have no bearing on the interpretation of its legal agreements with consumers, especially when those principles are used to engender public trust? It was a devastating question. It merged Bondi's moral argument with a concrete legal query. Roberts was trapped. If he said yes, he would sound like the most cynical kind of corporate mercenary, arguing that promises of ethics are meaningless marketing fluff. If he said no, he would be admitting that Bondi's point was valid, that the ethical code was relevant, and his entire defense, built on the sole supremacy of the user agreement, would crumble. He stood at the lectern, the eyes of the legal world upon him. He looked at Judge Sharma. He looked at his notes. He looked at the ceiling. The clock on the wall ticked, each second echoing like a drumbeat in the silent room. He opened his mouth to speak, a slight inhalation of breath, but no words followed. He closed it. He shuffled the single sheet of paper in front of him. His mind, a machine of legendary speed and precision, was, for the first time, grinding to a halt. He had no counter. There was no precedent for this. Bondi had created a closed logical loop, and he was caught inside it. He looked over at Pam Bondi. Her expression was not one of triumph. It was calm, steady, almost sympathetic. She wasn't gloating. She was simply waiting. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10, 15. It became an entity in itself, a vacuum that was pulling all the air, all the certainty, out of Jonathan Roberts' side of the room. The confidence he had exuded all morning had evaporated, replaced by a stark, public vulnerability. He had been utterly and completely disarmed. He had no more arguments to present. Finally, with a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head, he simply gathered his single piece of paper from the lectern. He didn't look at the judges. He looked at his table, and without another word, He turned and walked back to his seat. He sat down heavily, the sound of his chair creaking in the stillness. He stared at the polished surface of the table in front of him, his face a blank canvas of defeat. The power shift in the courtroom was not a tremor. It was a tectonic event. The silence of Jonathan Roberts was louder and more conclusive than any argument he could have possibly made. It was an admission, an unwilling, unspoken concession that he had been beaten, not on a technicality, but on the fundamental premise of his case. Pam Bondi's iron-fisted approach, a grip not of aggression, but of unshakable moral and logical consistency, had frozen the entire proceeding. She hadn't just won the point, she had seized ownership of the entire narrative. Her authority, once questioned, was now absolute, established not by the volume of her voice, but by the profound silence of her opponent. Chief Judge Vance looked from the still, silent Roberts to the composed, waiting Bondi. Her face betrayed a flicker of something close to astonishment. She exchanged a glance with her fellow judges. Judge Thorne, the hardened skeptic, slowly leaned back in his chair, his expression one of grudging respect. Judge Sharma was already writing furiously, a small, knowing smile on her face. Very well, Judge Vance said, her voice finally breaking the spell. We have heard the arguments from both sides. The court will take this matter under advisement. We are adjourned. The sharp crack of the gavel was like a starter pistol. The courtroom erupted. The spell was broken, and in its place was a frenzy. Reporters were on their feet, shouting questions, their fingers flying across their phones. Ben Carter slumped back in his chair, letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding for the entire 30 minutes. He looked at Pam, his eyes wide, with a reverence that transcended professional admiration. Pam, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I've never seen anything like that. Ever. Pam gave a small, tired nod. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of a battle hard won. Let's go, Ben. It's over for today. As they packed their folder, a wave of people began to move toward them. Not just reporters, but other lawyers, legal scholars, even a few spectators who had been in the public gallery. They didn't mob her. They approached with a sense of deference. Masterful, Ms. Bondi. A truly historic argument. Thank you for what you did in there. She nodded, accepting the praise with grace, but deflecting any sense of personal victory. The facts spoke for themselves, she said to one well-wisher, a sentiment that was both humble and a final, subtle underscoring of her strategy. Across the room, Jonathan Roberts was being shielded by his junior associates, who formed a protective phalanx around him as they quickly gathered their belongings. He didn't look up. He moved like a man in a daze, his gaze fixed on the floor as his team hustled him out a side door. Away from the ravenous cameras, the image was stark. Pam Bondi, surrounded by a crowd of admirers, Jonathan Roberts, fleeing into a quiet hallway. His towering reputation suddenly, visibly diminished. Outside, the scene was even more chaotic than when they arrived. The news had already broken. Sarah Jennings, the determined journalist who had been covering the case from the beginning, was doing a live stand-up on the courthouse steps. Her voice was electric with the energy of the moment. I am standing outside the federal courthouse, where something truly remarkable has just occurred, she said into the camera, her breath misting in the cool air. In a stunning turn of events, Attorney General Pam Bondi, in her closing remarks in the landmark case against Omnicorp, delivered what can only be described as a knockout blow. She completely dismantled the defense of celebrated counsel Jonathan Roberts, culminating in a moment of stunning silence where Roberts, left with no possible rebuttal, simply returned to his seat. We have a clip of that moment, and I warn you, it is riveting. Her network cut to the courtroom feed. The entire world could now see it. The cavernous, silent room, Judge Sharma's pointed question, and Jonathan Roberts, standing alone at the lectern, speechless. The silence, even on television, was deafening. The clip ended, and the broadcast cut back to Sarah. Legal experts are already calling this one of the most effective and decisive closing arguments in recent memory, she continued. Bondi didn't just argue the law. She argued the principle. using Omnicorp's own code of ethics against them in a move that has left the legal community reeling. The power dynamic in this case, and perhaps in the larger debate about corporate accountability, has just fundamentally shifted as Pam and Ben made their way to their car. Her phone began to vibrate incessantly. Emails, text messages, social media notifications. The story was spreading like wildfire. The hashtag Bondi silences Roberts was already trending. Memes were being created. A picture of Jonathan Roberts at the lectern with the caption loading, "Please wait," or an image of Pam Bondi with the words "Objection, I think not." Back in the quiet sanctuary of the hotel suite, the television was on, tuned to a major news network. A panel of experts was dissecting the hearing. Mark Riley, a seasoned political and legal analyst known for his calm, measured takes, was leaning forward, his expression animated. "Let's be very clear about what we witnessed today," he said to the host. "This wasn't just a lawyer winning a case. This was a paradigm shift. For years, these tech giants have operated behind a shield of incomprehensible user agreements and an army of untouchable lawyers. They controlled the narrative. What Pam Bondi did was puncture that shield. She didn't use jargon or complex legal theory. She used simple, powerful tools, her opponent's own hypocrisy and the undeniable truth." Another panelist, a former corporate lawyer, chimed in. "What was so iron-fisted, to use the term I'm seeing everywhere, about her approach? Was it sheer logical perfection? It was a checkmate. There was no move Roberts could make. She forced him to choose between his client's legal position and its public claim to integrity. By remaining silent, he chose to protect the legal position, but in doing so, he publicly sacrificed the integrity for a brand like Omnicorp, built on the idea of trust. That's a catastrophic loss, regardless of what the judges ultimately rule." Ben sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, a wide grin on his face. "They're calling it the silence heard around the world," he said, reading a headline from a major news site. "Every outlet, from the most serious legal journals to the most frivolous blogs, is leading with it. You didn't just make an argument, Pam. You created a moment." Pam was standing by the window again, just as she had been that morning. The city was now bathed in the warm, golden light of late afternoon. The view was the same, but her relationship to it felt different. The weight she had felt in the morning was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer just the weight of the fight, but the weight of the victory and the responsibility that came with it. She thought of Jonathan Roberts. She felt no malice toward him, only a professional's respect for a defeated adversary. He had played the game he knew, the game he had always won, but she had changed the rules. She had insisted that the game be played on a field of ethics and common sense, not just on the barren ground of legal precedent. Her firm control, the iron fist the media was celebrating, had not come from a place of anger or a desire to dominate. It had come from a place of profound conviction, a conviction that the law must serve people, not the other way around, a conviction that trust, once given, must be honored, a conviction that silence, in the face of a direct moral challenge, is its own kind of answer. The media frenzy would continue for days. The political implications would be debated for months. The judge's final ruling was still to come, though. Few now doubted when it would be. But in that quiet hotel suite, high above the clamor, the true conclusion had already been reached. The moment was not just about a legal victory. It was about the restoration of a principle. It was a reminder that in the grand courtroom of public opinion, and sometimes even in a court of law, the most powerful statement is not a complex argument, but an unassailable truth, delivered with such clarity and force that it leaves even the most brilliant opponent with nothing left to say. The days that followed the hearing were a whirlwind of media analysis and political fallout. The clip of Jonathan Roberts' silence became an iconic piece of footage, endlessly replayed and deconstructed. It was a visual metaphor for the crumbling of an old guard. The moment a seemingly invincible fortress of corporate power was shown to have no foundation. The narrative had been irrevocably seized. Pam Bondi was no longer the underdog. She was the giant slayer dot in the Omnicorp boardroom. The atmosphere was funereal. The emergency meeting had been convened less than an hour after the hearing adjourned. CEO Julian Croft, a man whose public persona was one of a visionary tech guru, was pacing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Silicon Valley. His face, usually a mask of relaxed confidence, was pale and tight with anger. Jonathan Roberts sat at the long, polished table, his hands folded, his gaze distant. He had flown back to California on a private jet, the entire flight a cocoon of suffocating silence. "What happened, John?" Croft's voice was low, seething. "You told me this was a slam dunk. You told me Hallowell Tech Systems was our firewall. You told me she had nothing." Roberts finally looked up, his eyes weary. "She changed the battlefield, Julian. We were prepared for a legal fight. She turned it into a referendum on our soul. Our soul." Croft scoffed, turning from the window. "We're a corporation, not a church. This is about shareholder value, not salvation. That ethics code, that was PR, a branding exercise. You were supposed to dismiss it as such. And how would that have played out?" Roberts retorted, a spark of his old fire returning. "Judge Sharma asks me if our ethics are meaningless. And I say yes, Your Honor, they are." The clip of that would have been 10 times more damaging than my silence. She put me in an impossible position. Anything I said would have been an affirmation of her central point, that our public promises are a lie. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. They were business people, used to quantifiable risks and manageable outcomes. They were not equipped for a crisis of public faith. Their stock had already taken a significant hit in after-hours trading. The hashtag delete Omnicorp was gaining traction. The problem was no longer contained to a courtroom. It was metastasizing in the court of public opinion. "So what do we do?" a board member asked, her voice thin. "What's our play now?" Roberts sighed, the fight draining out of him again. "There's no play, not in the short term. We wait for the ruling, which, I can now say with near certainty, will not be in our favor. And then we begin the long, arduous, and astronomically expensive process of trying to rebuild public trust. We will have to consent to oversight. We will have to fundamentally change our data practices. We will have to prove that our ethics code is more than just branding." The irony was bitter, and it hung in the room like smoke. In her victory, Pam Bondi had forced them to live up to their own marketing. Meanwhile, in D.C., Pam and Ben were conducting a meticulous postmortem. They weren't celebrating. They were preparing for the next phase. "The ruling will likely remand the case to the lower courts with new instructions," Pam said, pointing to a flowchart she'd drawn on a whiteboard. "The appellate court won't set the specific penalties. They'll establish the new precedent that user agreements can be invalidated if they are found to be coercive or if they contradict a company's own stated ethical standards in a way that misleads the public. That's the big win." Ben nodded, scribbling notes. "So, we go back to the district court to argue damages and remedies. But this time, we'll be arguing with the wind at our backs. The entire legal framework has shifted in our favor." "Exactly," Pam said. "Omnicorp will try to settle. They'll offer a massive sum to make this go away. And we will have to decide what a meaningful settlement looks like. It can't just be a check. It has to be systemic change, independent audits, transparent algorithms, real, user-friendly privacy controls. The money is secondary. The precedent is what matters." Her phone buzzed. It was a call from the governor of her home state. She answered, her tone professional but warm. "Governor." "Yes, it was a good day for the people of our state. Thank you. But the credit belongs to the whole team." "I agree. The work is just beginning." As she spoke, Ben watched her, marveling at her composure. The media was hailing her as a hero, a political superstar in the making. Pundits were already speculating about her future run for the Senate, perhaps even higher office. But Pam herself seemed utterly unconcerned with the political chatter. Her focus remained laser-sharp on the case, on the details, on the long road still ahead. Her iron-fisted control wasn't just a courtroom tactic, it was a fundamental aspect of her character. She was disciplined, focused, and driven by the substance of the work, not the accolades that came with it. A week later, Sarah Jennings secured an exclusive interview with Pam. They sat not in a stuffy office, but on a park bench overlooking the tidal basin. It was a calculated choice, meant to project accessibility and a connection to the public. Ms. Bondi, Sarah began, the world is talking about the silence when you were standing at that lectern, and you saw Jonathan Roberts with no response. What was going through your mind? Pam considered the question carefully. I wasn't thinking about Mr. Roberts, actually. I was thinking about the people we were representing. The couple who had their private grief turned into a marketing demographic. The teenager who was profiled based on his search history. I was thinking that for them, this was the moment their voice was finally heard in a room where they had never been invited. Mr. Roberts' silence wasn't a vacuum. It was filled with the voices of all those people. It was a perfect answer, sincere, powerful, and it redirected the focus from her personal triumph to the principle she was fighting for. Many are saying this case has changed everything for big tech. Sarah continued. Do you agree? I think this case was a course correction. Pam replied. Technology has been moving at light speed, and the law, by its nature, moves more deliberately. This was a moment where the law began to catch up. It's not about stopping innovation. It's about ensuring that our technological progress is aligned with our human values. It's a reminder that terms and conditions cannot be a substitute for a social contract. The interview, when it aired, further solidified her public image, a thoughtful, principled leader who was more interested in policy than in personality. She had won the battle, and now she was winning the peace, shaping the narrative of what her victory meant on her own terms. 2 weeks after the hearing, the appellate court released its opinion. It was a unanimous 3-0 decision. Chief Judge Vance wrote the majority opinion, and it was a landmark document. It didn't just cite legal precedent. It engaged with the realities of the digital age. Vance wrote, to argue, as the appellee does, that a multi-billion-dollar corporation and an individual consumer are equal parties in the negotiation of a digital contract is to ignore the profound power imbalance inherent in the modern internet, when a service becomes quasi-essential for social and economic participation. The choice to accept its terms is a choice under duress. Furthermore, a corporation cannot be allowed to build a brand on the promise of trust and ethical behavior, and then, in a court of law, claim that those promises are legally meaningless. To do so would be to sanction a form of institutional bad faith. The doctrine of consent must evolve. It must mean informed consent, and the entity seeking that consent has a duty to be transparent and to act in a manner consistent with the trust it solicits. The opinion quoted directly from Pam's closing argument, citing her analogy of applying horse and buggy laws to a supersonic jet. It even referenced the Omnicorp Ethics Code, stating that while not a traditional contract, it was highly relevant in assessing the reasonableness of a consumer's expectations and the overall fairness of the user agreement. The case was remanded to the lower court. Just as Pam had predicted, the victory was total. In the aftermath, Jonathan Roberts quietly resigned from his position as lead counsel for Omnicorp. He released a short statement announcing his move to a teaching position at a prestigious law school. It is time, the statement read, for a new generation of lawyers to grapple with the complex intersection of law, technology, and ethics. It was a graceful exit, but everyone in the legal community understood it for what it was, an abdication. The master of the old game was leaving the field as the new rules were being written. 6 months later, the settlement was announced. Omnicorp agreed to pay a record-breaking fine to the coalition of states, but more importantly, they agreed to a sweeping set of reforms, all legally binding and subject to independent oversight. They would overhaul their user agreements into a simple, easy-to-understand format. They would provide users with a clear dashboard to control exactly what data was collected and how it was used. They would no longer use voice data for advertising purposes, and they would fund a multi-billion-dollar independent foundation dedicated to promoting digital literacy and privacy rights. It was a victory that would echo for decades. It reshaped an entire industry. On the day the settlement was finalized, Pam and Ben stood once more in her office, the Washington, D.C. skyline behind them. The media storm had long since passed. The case files were being boxed up for the archives. A sense of quiet finality filled the room. You know, Ben said, looking at a framed newspaper clipping on the wall, a photo of Pam at the lectern. Calm and resolute. I'll tell my grandkids about this. About the day you walked into that courtroom and changed the world with a single sheet of paper. And a question. Pam smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. It was never about me, Ben, or even about Omnicorp. It was about that line, the line between progress and predation. Someone had to draw it clearly. We just happened to be the ones holding the pen. She looked out the window, her gaze thoughtful. The iron-fisted warrior the media had portrayed was, in reality, a quiet architect. She hadn't demolished a building. She had reinforced its foundation. Her authority had been forged not in a moment of dramatic confrontation, but in the countless hours of preparation, in the deep-seated belief in her cause, and in the simple, audacious idea that the most powerful force in any argument is the unvarnished truth. The silence of her opponent was merely the echo of that truth, a resounding confirmation that in the end, some things are simply not open for debate. The victory was conclusive, her control over the narrative absolute, and the legacy of that single, silent moment in a quiet courtroom was now etched into the law of the land.